O som não está.
Yeah, okay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon for who is listening to us and watching us in Brazil. Good evening to our friends from Palestine. Today is the fourth lecture. We will enter from the historical period from the Oslo's agreements in the beginning of the 90s, when we had this hope that we could have a path for peace and justice, and to the period of today. And for this, we have a very special lecture of Dr. Ghassan Al-Khatib, and I will ask Dr. Raghda Shamali from the International Corporation of Birzeit to introduce Ghassan. And we also have here with us Professor Mohammed Nadir, who is leading this Center for Arab and Islamic Studies at our university. Please, Raghda.
Thank you, Dr. Giorgio. Good evening. We are really happy to continue this collaboration and having the fourth lecture of our online course. I am really honored to present Dr. Ghassan Al-Khatib, to the speaker of our today lecture. Dr. Ghassan is a member of the Board of Trustees of Birzeit University and lecturer at the international studies. He also used to be the vice president for advancement and communication for 3 years before being BOT member. Currently, he is lecturer of international studies and cultural studies. Before, he also was the director of Government Media Center and the spokesperson of government in 2009 till 2012. Dr. Ghassan was the Minister of Labor in 2002 till 2005, as well as Minister of Planning for the period from 2005 and 2006, as the Vice President, and also was the Vice President for Community Outreach at Birzeit University in 2006 till 2009. So without so much delay, I'm so interested about this lecture, and because also Dr. Ghassan holds a PhD in Middle East politics from the University of Durham in UK, and he's the author of Palestinian Politics and the Middle East Peace Process. So welcome, Doctor. With no more delay, I give him the floor.
Thank you, Raghda. And thanks for everybody taking part in this very interesting occasion. I'm grateful and I'm honored to have the opportunity to talk to you about this very interesting subject. Probably complicated a little bit, but I think that it is interesting. So I am supposed to cover the period between the beginning of the convening of the peace conference, the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and the agreement that is called Oslo Agreement that resulted from this process until the current period. This is a little bit tricky because it confuses history with contemporary politics. So I will do my best to differentiate between the two as much as I can. And if I speak fast, please let me know in order to slow down. In your last lecture, the lecture ended by talking about the Great Intifada, or the First Intifada. And now we will start from the next important episode in the history and in the recent history of the Palestinian people, which is called the peace process, which ended by Oslo Agreement. I want to say that there is significant linkage between that intifada and this peace process. The Palestinian Great Intifada, in my view, was the most interesting phase in the history of the struggle of the Palestinian people against the Israeli occupation and in order to achieve liberty and freedom. It was special and probably more significant than any other part of our recent history because it showed unity of the Palestinian people. It showed the ability to conduct non-violent civil disobedience kind of struggle against occupation. It involved, in the same time, all areas of the Palestinian territories, urban areas, rural areas, refugee camps. It also involved all sectors of the society, workers, farmers, private sector, women, men. So it expressed the most obvious level of unity. And probably because of this and because of its nonviolent nature, it also attracted the attention of the outside world more than ever in the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I also want to add, and by this I link it to the next phase, which is the peace process, that this was the major challenge for the Israeli occupation in the history of the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israeli occupation. You know, Israel is so powerful militarily. And in all previous phases of Palestinian struggle, when Palestinians resorted mainly to armed struggle, Israel was always able to find a way to topple this struggle and to be able to have the upper hand militarily because of its military strength. When the Palestinian neutralized arms in the first Intifada, Israel was unable to face this challenge, and Israel was unable to defeat the Palestinians to the first time. And therefore, Israel made a significant concession by accepting to try to solve this conflict in political means rather than in military means and by strength and violence. Because until then, Israel used to refuse to negotiate with Palestinians for an obvious reason. If Israel would negotiate with the representatives of the Palestinians, then this will entail indirectly that Israel acknowledge that there is a Palestinian people. And if there is a Palestinian people, then this people is entitled to self-determination and independence and statehood. So to avoid such obligation, Israel until then used to refuse the principle of negotiating with Palestinian representative, and rather insisted and demanded negotiations on the future of Palestinians and Palestine with Arab governments, sometimes with Jordan and sometimes with Egypt, as happened in Camp David negotiations. So, as a result of the pressure of the Intifada, Israel agreed to the first time to negotiate with Palestinian representative in the peace process that the Americans suggested. Of course, and therefore, the Intifada is one of the factors that made this peace process possible. But of course, that was not the only factor. And I will mention few other factors that contributed to the possibility of having a peace process and bilateral direct negotiations between Israel and representatives of the Palestinian people. The other factor is the Gulf War, because, you know, this peace process, which started in 1991, came a year after the end of the Gulf War. And the Gulf War was a factor for two reasons. Number one, it ended by weakening the Arab front, which is the backbone of support for the Palestinian people. So it shifted the balance of powers against the Arabs and Palestinians. And therefore, the Americans and probably the Israelis realized that maybe the time is right for them to start such peace process. The other is that the United States, during the Gulf War, faced significant criticisms in the region and was accused of double standard, because, you know, in the Gulf War, United States came with its forces to try to end, in military means, the Iraqi occupation over Kuwait, on the basis that this occupation is not legal, while it did not do anything to end the illegal Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. So there were lots of criticisms that embarrassed the United States and also embarrassed the allies of the United States in the Arab countries. So in order to balance their position, they promised their allies in the Arab world to try to double their efforts to try to end the Israeli occupation and to solve the Palestinian problem. The other factor is the decaying and later the fall of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was a superpower that was supportive of the Palestinian people and their struggle. The weakness and the decaying and later the fall of the Soviet Union shifted the balance of powers to the favor of the Americans and the Israelis, and encouraged them to try to go for a peace process, hoping that they can achieve what was not possible when the Palestinians were stronger, with the backing and the support of that superpower, the Soviet Union. The last factor is the unusually significant diplomatic efforts exerted by the President of the United States and his Secretary of State. At that time, the president was President Bush, the father, and the Secretary of State was James Baker. There was a great deal of determination on behalf of the administration to succeed in this mission. I remember that Secretary of State made, within the 6 months of preparations for this process, 18 visits to the region. In each, he was visiting Tel Aviv to talk to the Israelis, Jerusalem to talk to the Palestinian representative, Amman to talk to the Jordanians, Damascus, Beirut, Cairo, etc. And as a result of these efforts, and of course with the different factors that I mentioned, that peace process was possible, and it started with convening what was called at that time the Middle East Peace Conference in Madrid. That was the opening ceremony for the peace process. And that conference was attended on the level of heads of states and foreign ministers. It included the President of the United States, the leader of the Soviet Union, the Prime Minister of Israel, and foreign ministers of most of the Arab countries that are involved, in addition to the Secretary General of the United Nations. The invitation to the parties of that conference was made jointly by the government of the United States and the Soviet Union. That conference was the opening, and it was followed by bilateral negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian representatives, and another track of bilateral negotiations between Israel and Jordan, Israel and Lebanon, and Israel and Syria. In addition, there was also a multilateral process of negotiations whereby multilateral teams were established by representatives of these countries on specific topics. One was regional economic development, one was regional environment, one was regional security, and so on. And these negotiations continued for 1 to 2 years, depending on the country. However, these talks failed in reaching successful conclusion as far as Israel and Palestine are concerned. The only track which succeeded in reaching an agreement was Jordan-Israel. They reached an agreement that was called Wadi Araba Agreement that was signed in 93, in 92, I'm not sure, 92 or 93. The talks with Syria did not produce an agreement. The talks with Lebanon did not produce an agreement. And the talks with the Palestinian delegation, which was a Palestinian delegation from the Palestinian occupied territories and not including the PLO, because that was a condition by Israel. Israel at that time refused to allow Palestinians from the PLO to be part of the delegation. I was member of the Palestinian delegation that negotiated, beginning with Madrid conference, for 2 years in Washington. And this track did not make any progress. And I will list 3 factors which I think were responsible for the fact that this peace process was not successful and did not reach an agreement. The first one is that the terms of reference for the peace process were very vague and very broad, to the extent that each party entered the negotiations with their original positions and narratives. So Palestinians entered the negotiations with the position that these talks should end by ending the Israeli occupation and achieving independence and Palestinian statehood, while Israel was hoping that these talks will end by peace treaties between Israel and the rest of the Arab countries and normal relations between Israel and the Arab countries. So the vagueness of the terms of reference combined with the bias of the sponsor of these negotiations, which is the United States, were significant factors contributing to the failure of the peace process. The second factor is the weakness of the Palestinian side in this peace process. The Palestinians entered the peace process from a weak point of view because of many factors that probably we can come to later if needed. But the Palestinians were not in a good position and they were not united, and their negotiating performance was not perfect. In fact, I dealt with the weaknesses in the Palestinian negotiating performance in the book that Raghda mentioned when she introduced me to this lecture. The third factor, the third defect in this process is that Israel was dragged by force to enter this peace process. It was sort of forced by the United States to go to this peace process, and Israel was not convinced to do that. And by the way, later, after these 2 years of negotiations, the Israeli Prime Minister at that time, Yitzhak Shamir, made a statement saying that we were intending to negotiate for 10 years, and we were not intending to allow these negotiations to reach conclusion because we were not happy with it in the first place. And I will come to that later, because the fact that Israel was not convinced with this peace process had very significant effects on the internal political dynamics in Israel. Now, the main reason why Palestinians and Israelis could not reach an agreement in spite of 2 years of negotiations in Washington was one point that was a stumbling block in the negotiations, which is the position over the issue of the illegal Jewish settlements that were built in the Palestinian occupied territories. Because for your background, with the beginning of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza Strip in 1967, Israel started a process of building Jewish settlements in Palestinian land that it used to confiscate from the Palestinians and bring Jewish settlers to live in settlements in the Palestinian occupied territories. In the negotiations in Washington, the Palestinian delegation insisted that any agreement should include an Israeli commitment to stop the expansion of settlements. And in return, Israel refused that always and insisted to refuse including such clause or such obligation on Israel. I can come back later to explain why, but that was the single most significant point that prevented the negotiations from reaching an agreement. Now, when Israel realized that in their negotiations with the Palestinian delegation, which came from the Palestinian occupied territories, was unable to move forward, they accepted secretly an invitation by the Norwegian government to host secret negotiations in Oslo between representatives of Israeli government and PLO directly. So Israel wanted to try to talk directly with the PLO, but they wanted to do that secretly. They negotiated secretly in Oslo with the PLO directly for 6 months, and these negotiations managed to make a breakthrough and to reach an agreement that was signed in September 1993, and it was called the Declaration of Principles, DOP, or according to the media, it was called Oslo I Agreement, because it was followed later by another detailed agreement that was called the Oslo Interim Agreement, and that was signed in September 28th, 1995, 2 years later. The reason why Washington negotiations failed to reach an agreement and Oslo secret negotiations was able to reach an agreement is that each of the two sides made a significant concession that made agreement possible. Palestinians, particularly the PLO, agreed on an agreement that does not commit Israel to stopping the expansion of settlements, which was a concession compared with the position of the Palestinian delegation in Washington. In return, Israel, which used to refuse to recognize the PLO as a representative of the Palestinians and refused to talk to the PLO directly, made the concession of accepting to talk to the PLO directly and recognizing the PLO as a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. So these two concessions made the agreement in Oslo possible, and therefore there were a series of agreements, the Declaration of Principles, and then the Interim Agreement, and then Wye River Agreement, and then there were 3 or 4 agreements that were combined together in one volume that is called the Interim Agreement, or now they refer to it as Oslo Agreement. The Oslo Agreement divided the solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into 2 phases. The agreement stipulates that in the first phase, the 2 sides agree on establishing an interim Palestinian authority for a period that is called the interim period for 5 years. In the 3rd year of these 5 years, the 2 sides should start what is called the final status negotiations, which are about negotiating the final settlement. And the Declaration of Principle specified these final status issues by 1, the issue of Jerusalem, 2, the future of settlements, Israeli settlements in the Palestinian territories, number 3, the borders between Israel and Palestine, and number 4, the security, and number 5, water. So in the interim period, there will be an interim Palestinian authority and sort of autonomy arrangements, and with the end, and that should last for 5 years, during which it was assumed that the parties should reach an agreement on the final issues: borders, security, Jerusalem, settlements, etc. And based on that, the Palestinians established their first ever authority on their land in election of a parliament that is called the Legislative Council, because it's not a state yet, and presidential elections. Yasser Arafat was elected as the president of the first Palestinian Authority, and we had a parliament or a legislative council of 120 members that were elected in 1996. Now, the period followed that agreement and followed the establishment of the Palestinian Authority and the return of the PLO to the Palestinian territories to take charge of the Palestinian Authority, the period since then witnessed very dramatic, unfortunate deterioration rather than progress in the relation between the two sides. And I will talk about two dynamics or two processes that were witnessed within the Israeli internal dynamics. The first one is a process of radicalization in the Israeli society. This tension inside the Israeli society started 2 months after signing the major agreement, when an Israeli Jewish terrorist assassinated the Israeli prime minister at that time, Yitzhak Rabin. Yitzhak Rabin is the prime minister who signed Oslo Agreement and who led Israel into the peace process and led Israel into the secret negotiations in Oslo, was assassinated 2 months after signing that agreement. This assassination was followed by election 3 months later. 3 months after the assassination, Israel had election in order to elect a replacement to Rabin. And the surprise was that the person who was elected was Netanyahu, the current prime minister, who was the leader of the party that led the opposition to the Oslo Agreement and the peace process, which reflected tension and polarization within the Israeli society. And Israel since then was divided between two camps. Camp that support the peace process and want to proceed with it, and another camp that opposed the peace process and want to stop the implementation of the Oslo Agreement. When Netanyahu was elected, he started two things. The first one is to delay or to stop or to prevent the implementation of the steps stipulated in Oslo Agreement. And in parallel, and in order to satisfy the right wing in Israel, he started the process of accelerating the expansion of these illegal settlements inside Israel. Now, the delay in implementing Oslo Agreement and the expediting of the expansion of the illegal settlements in the occupied territories reflected negatively on the internal political dynamics in the other side, in Palestine, because the Palestinian public started to realize that if this Oslo Agreement is not good enough to stop the expansion of settlements, how can it be good enough to end the Israeli occupation and to allow the Palestinians the right of self-determination and independence? So the settlement expansion, combined by the failure of the peace process to move forward, left very negative effect on the public stand, on the popularity of the agreement and of the Palestinian leadership that signed this agreement. So the Palestinian Authority started gradually to lose public support, and the opposition of the Palestinian Authority, which is led by Hamas, by the way, started to gain ground gradually. Until, by the way, in the next election, which took place in 2006, Hamas won the election, and Fatah, that was the leader of the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, lost these negotiations. But I want to say that these two processes were the major killer of the peace process, because it reflected negatively on the internal political dynamics both in Israel and Palestine. The history of the Israeli internal politics since the assassination of Rabin, by the way, until now, is a history of radicalization process. Since then, the composition of every Israeli Knesset is more radical than the one before. The composition of every Israeli cabinet is more radical than the one before, until we reached a reality where there is no longer even minority in Israel that support the principle of Israeli withdrawal of any part of the Palestinian occupied territories. During the peace process and during the life of Yitzhak Rabin, there used to be half and plus of the Israeli public opinion, half plus of the members of the Israeli parliament who support the historical compromise of ending the Israeli occupation over significant part of the occupied territories. And the discussion in Israel and between Israel and the Palestinians was about the borders, was about the percentage of the territories that Israel needs to evacuate in order to allow for the establishment of a Palestinian entity, state, something. But gradually, Israel witnessed a trend of change until we reached a point now, for example, there is no even 1% of the Israeli public opinion who agree on giving up the Israeli control, the Israeli occupation over any part of the Palestinian occupied territories. Now, this trend of radicalization included some fluctuations. For example, before the end of the century, Israel elected a prime minister from the Labour Party, Ehud Barak, who encouraged convening of a final status negotiations conference, which President Clinton invited the parties for in Camp David. And we had, to the first time, final status negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians on summit level between the 11th and the 25th of June in the year 2000s. These negotiations provoked the right wing in Israel and led to the fall of Barak's government. And immediately after that, the Israelis elected a Likud government. Likud is the opposition party to the peace process. And we came back to a reality where the Israeli government is composed mainly of the parties that opposes the peace process. And that government, which came after Barak, moved into a significant step in provocation of the Palestinians when the Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who is one of the most right-wing leaders in the history of Israel, made a provocative visit to Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, which led into Palestinian popular reaction and a series of strong demonstrations in protest of the entering of the Israeli prime minister to the mosque, which led into what is called in our recent history the Second Intifada, which is the bloodiest ever phase of confrontations between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and that was the beginning of the end of the peace process. On the Palestinian side, as I said, we started to witness a strange situation whereby the strength of the right wing in Israel was reinforcing the radicalization process in the Palestinian society. And the radicalization in the Palestinian society reinforces radicalization in Israel. So there was this process of radicalization reinforced each other and put us in some kind of a vicious circle whereby the two societies were radicalized. Palestinians realized that this peace process is not working. After 10 years of signing the peace process, Palestinians realized that the number of illegal Jewish settlements in the Palestinian territories was doubled, and the number of settlements were doubled. Therefore, Palestinian public lost faith in the peace process, and as I said, that led into the election of Hamas in the second and last, unfortunately, election in the Palestinian political system. And unfortunately, when Hamas won the election, Hamas formed a government, and there were some tension, especially in Gaza, between the followers of Hamas and the followers of Fatah, which ended up by fight that ended up by Hamas taking control in Gaza. And since then, Hamas, with the backing and support and finance of Iran, started to build up military abilities in order to contribute to the armed struggle against the Israeli occupation. And we witnessed actually 4 wars between Israel and Hamas, starting in the year 2008, and the last one in the year of 2023. After that, we are living now the 5th round of confrontations, which started in the 7th of October, when Hamas launched an attack on the adjacent Israeli settlements around Gaza, which led into this bloody war in which Israel until now have killed, the Israeli army killed so far 42,000 Palestinians in Gaza, most of which are children and women. And apparently they militarily reoccupied Gaza Strip. And with the beginning of this phase of confrontation, Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is an ally to Hamas, started an attrition war against Israel for 1 year, after which this attrition war expanded into the current full-fledged military confrontations between Israel and Hezbollah. And by this, I bring you to the current situations that we are living now. I did not focus on the current reality, on the contemporary political reality. I left that for discussion, and I tried to focus on the recent history and the developments between the two sides and inside the two societies that led into replacing the first ever peace process with the bloodiest ever fights and confrontations that are still going on. I stop here and will be more than happy to get into the discussion in which I try to answer any specific questions or concerns. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, Dr. Ghassan.
Well,
I will start off with some questions.
yes.
Questions which came up in discussions we had.
Yes.
So, well, let me put first. When you said in the conference of Madrid, in this peace talks, one of the main problems was the settlements issue. But what about the right to return? Was that also not one of the key problems in the discussions? That would be maybe you answer the questions and then we go to another one.
Yeah, I answer the question and then we go to the other.
Okay, let's do it like this.
I'll tell you why. It was agreed in the terms of reference of the peace process that the talks will be in two phases. The issue of the refugees and the right of return was specified to be one of the final status negotiations that needs to begin 3 years after signing the agreement. So in Washington, we were negotiating the interim phase, the interim arrangements, like the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, the establishment, what kind of responsibilities and authorities for the Palestinian Legislative Council, and so on. While it was agreed in the invitation that the future of Jerusalem, the future of settlements, the issue of right of return, which I forget to mention when I listed the final status negotiations, these issues, including the right of return or the refugees issue, were designated to be negotiated in the final status negotiations. That's why it was not on the table in the Madrid negotiations. And by the way, Israel was suggesting that since settlements, the future of settlements is supposed to be negotiated in the end, then let's not talk about it. So we insisted that even if the future of settlements will be determined later, the expansion of settlements needs to be fixed now. So no matter what the future of settlements are going to be, we need an Israeli commitment to stop expanding the settlements during the interim phase. And that was the major problem.
Okay, I have here another question. Doctor, considering the subdivisions of the West Bank after the Oslo Accords, how do you view the differences in the way Israel treats Palestinians living in Area A, B, and C? Also, how do these differences in treatment impact Palestinian society and its collective struggle for liberation?
Yeah, according to the stipulations of the agreement, the division of areas A, B, C is supposed to be finished during the interim period, because the agreement stipulated in clear terms that the areas C and B needs to be transferred to become areas A gradually in 3 phases. But Israel did not implement that. Originally, Area A is supposed to be under the administration and control of the Palestinian Authority. Area B should follow the Palestinian Authority administratively speaking, and Area C will remain under the Israeli control. However, this needs to change in 3 phases in 3 years. Now, in the beginning, Israel did not interfere in Area A, but that lasted only for a year or 2. And gradually, Israel started to breach the agreement by interfering in areas A and B. And now, for example, Israel do not differentiate at all. Israel no longer recognize this division of areas A and B and C. And therefore, we see the Israeli army functioning in Area C, in Area B, and in Area C. And the Palestinians are undertaking whatever means of rejection and resistance of that occupation equally in areas A and B and C.
Okay, thank you. That was clear. Now there is a question which I will first ask another question. It's on the internal divisions of the Palestinian resistance. You explained that the loss of confidence of the Palestinians in the occupied territories in the Palestinian National Authority because of there was no results of the Oslo agreements. That reinforced the position of Hamas, right? That's what you explained. Now, the question is, there were also other views in the Palestinian society. I'm referring to the left-wing groups like the Popular Front, the Democratic Front. Why didn't they got stronger once Fatah lost its authority? That would be a first question.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and I'm not sure that I have a precise answer to this. I used to belong, for example, to one of these leftist groups in the PLO, and we also were asking ourselves this question. I think for reasons that might be beyond the need of this session, the Palestinian society also witnessed move to become more religious. And I think that Palestinian public, for that reason, become more attracted to resistance factions that are religious, like Hamas, rather than resistance factions that adopts leftist, Marxist kind of political views. Second, Hamas is the resistance expression of a party that is very deeply rooted in the Palestinian society, which is the Muslim Brotherhood movement, which is very strong in Egypt and in Jordan and in Palestine and in most of the Arab countries. So there is a very strong popular basis for this movement. So when an average Palestinian would see a movement that combines religion with resistance, I think, given the nature of the society, the religious nature of the society, I think such movement that combine religion, religious commitment, and commitment to resistance is candidate to be more popular than others. As I told you, I do not have a well-studied response, but this is what comes to my mind in response to your question.
But let me then,
yeah,
there are two issues here on this.
Please.
A personal one. I was in 87 at your university for a couple of months. 87, just before the first Intifada.
Yeah.
That was when Hamas was organized, got organized and at the university. And the impression I had, and the impression that many Palestinians gave to me, that the Israelis were very, very easy on these groups and very tough on more left-wing groups. And this brings me to the question of Luis Henrique, who asks, to what extent is the internal division, or was the internal division between Palestinians built and encouraged by the Israeli governments, and maybe the Americans also, exactly to obtain better conditions for Israel?
Yeah, very interesting. And I'm so glad that you said that, not me, because I agree on this argument. And it would be probably stronger when it comes from you. So thank you. I can even go further in the same line of argument. Personally, I belong to the age of the first Intifada. I was a part of it, and I was arrested as a result of it, and I was part of its leadership. So I know enough about it. And you are correct. At that period, Israel, in an indirect way, encouraged the Islamist movement, Hamas, by being soft with them. And in the same time, they were very tough with the other groups. By the way, the PLO groups, left and right. I mean, that includes Fatah also. During the Intifada, Israel was more tough against the PLO factions, left and Fatah, and less harsh, or probably relatively soft, with Hamas. Of course, that was not the case in the second Intifada, because this changed. Now, I want to go further and say that this is not only analysis and conclusions from analysis. It's a fact, because in one meeting in Cairo that included Yitzhak Rabin, President Mubarak, Yasser Arafat, and many other top leaders, that subject was opened to discussion, and Rabin himself, on the records in that meeting, admitted that Israel was trying to encourage indirectly Hamas in order to weaken the PLO, because the PLO was leading the first Intifada, and Israel was having difficulties with the first Intifada. So one of the political tactics Israel, according to Rabin, pursued is to try to encourage in an indirect way the rising of Hamas as an opposition to the PLO in order to balance or to offset the strength and popularity of the PLO. And I think that Israel, after the Hamas taking over of Gaza, Israel encouraged the continuity of this split and encouraged the division of this split, because dividing the Palestinian territories into West Bank and Gaza, and the absence of unity of the Palestinian territories and politics would save Israel the difficulty of refusing the Palestinian and international demand of two-state solution by using the excuse that Palestine is divided anyhow, and the Palestinians are divided. So Israel had an interest in maintaining and keeping this division and even encouraging it. And there are several indicators that show the Israeli interest and contribution to keeping the current division and split between the Palestinians, the different Palestinian factions. Having said that, I don't think that the main blame is on Israel. I think that we have to be frank and courageous enough and to have self-criticism and hold ourselves as Palestinians the main and primary responsibility for this split, which is a shame, in fact, that needs to end, because it is the major source of weakness for the Palestinian people and Palestinian struggle.
Very interesting, Dr. Ghassan. We had the same question of Bruno Mendelski. Also, he thanks you very much for the lecture, and he also the same question. I would like to know whether you believe that undermining of the legitimacy and the credibility of the Palestinian Authority by Israel was orchestrated by Israel, was its indirect support for Hamas in the beginning, so that the continued use of force by Palestine could just justify Israeli military action occupation. But you just answered it. But the following one goes a little bit further. Bruno Alexander Reyes Costa asks, thank you for the talk. Is it unfair to say that Oslo was placed as a trap to demilitarize part of the Palestinian resistance in exchange for a supposed solution that was indefinitely postponed? Also to create a regional economic and military dependency on Zionist presence in Palestine. In the end, the only thing that seems to matter for all parties in Israel's is Israel's security, and Israel built always new enemies. And then it stopped. Well, I think that the point is clear.
Yeah, the point is clear.
It's about
Oslo
was it not? Yeah, was it not? Maybe now, looking back, and of course you participated, so you was it not? Were we not a little bit naive, or too optimistic, or too unrealistic to really believe that Oslo talks would lead to peace and justice for the Palestinian people?
Not only in retrospect, but what I will say in my answer was my position at that time. Because, we, the members of the Palestinian delegation in Washington, who came from the Palestinian territories, felt betrayed when the PLO conducted from our backs secret negotiations in Oslo, in which they gave up, made a significant concession, which was a major mistake. And I can tell you that Oslo agreement is not only a trap, but it is a disaster. It's a big mistake. Anybody who understands the Israeli mentality, understands the Israeli internal politics, understand the significance of the settlement expansion process would tell you that if we will have a peace process and settlement expansion process in parallel, then the settlement expansion process will kill the peace process. And it did. That's why allowing Oslo agreement to be reached by giving this concession on settlement expansion was a big disaster. And it allowed Israel to reach the conclusion that they can, as there is a saying in English, you cannot eat the cake and keep it in the same time. You cannot eat the apple and keep it in the same time. So Israel realized that probably we can eat the cake and keep it in the same time, in the sense that, the peace process was about the exchange of land for peace. The essence of the peace process was about the exchange of land for peace. So Israel will give up the land it occupied in 1967, and in return, the Arabs and the Palestinians will give Israel peace by signing peaceful agreements. Now, when Israel managed to convince the PLO to give these concessions, I think that the Israelis, and Israel is a transparent political system. You can easily follow their internal debates, their positions, their discussions, etc. They realized that maybe we do not have to give up the land in order to get the peace. Maybe we can get both. Maybe we can reach agreements with Arab countries without necessarily paying the price of withdrawing from the Palestinian occupied territories. And therefore, Oslo Agreement was a big disaster. Oslo Agreement was like a crime from a Palestinian perspective. And until now, we are paying the price for Oslo Agreement in two ways. Number one, we are paying the price in our internal politics, because Oslo Agreement was responsible for the division within the Palestinian politics, or at least deepening the division within the Palestinian politics. So part of this division is resulted from Oslo Agreement, which was very controversial within the Palestinian society. And second, it is responsible for allowing Israel to continue the occupation while continuing developing peaceful relations with the Arab countries. So they signed, before Oslo, they signed an agreement with Egypt, and after Oslo, they signed an agreement with Jordan, and later we all witnessed the developments of relations between Israel and few Arab countries, Morocco, Sudan, Arab Emirates. So we made, I think, the PLO made a grave mistake in Oslo, and we are paying the price of it until now.
That's a very clear standpoint. Thank you very much. Now let's go to another subject. Barbara Caetano, she asked, Professor, how do you see the current international political situation with the elections in the United States? If the elections in the United States can influence the developments? And I would add to that, if you could say a little bit, what about, is China, can China play a bigger role in your struggle? We all witnessed the efforts of China to bring all the different fractions together, at least for the photo. So
Yeah.
on the international.
On the international, and I focus on the United States and the election there. I should tell you that the change in the United States between Democrats and Republicans never made a change in the American Middle East policy. There might be differences between the two parties, and the election of a different party might have changes in the American policies on anything, but not on the Middle East. That is our experience in all previous negotiations, in all previous elections. That's why Palestinians are never excited about the Israeli elections, about the American elections. American election is very attractive, and the whole world is following it, I think, except the Palestinians, or at least the Palestinians are the least to be excited about the American elections, because the change of presidents do not leave any effect on or make any change in the American Middle East policy, with one exception, which is the election of Trump. Trump went out of the traditional line of the American Middle East politics and exaggerated the Americans' bias to Israel and took many practical steps that were extremely harmful politically to the Palestinians and practically. First, he moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and he recognized Jerusalem as capital to Israel. He also closed the representative office of the PLO that was serving as a Palestinian embassy in Washington. He closed it, and it's still closed. And he also stopped all kind of American financial contribution to both the UNRWA, which is responsible for the welfare of the Palestinian refugees and refugee camps, not only in the Palestinian territories, but also in Lebanon and Jordan and Syria. And he also stopped all kind of American financial contribution and aid to the Palestinian Authority and to the Palestinians in the occupied territories. Now, whether Trump or Harris will win this election, we don't know if there is going to be a change, simply because Trump, if you notice, have chosen to be silent about what's going on in the Middle East. And I think this is very clever on his behalf, because now the war in the Middle East is very thorny in the American elections. If you appear to be against the Palestinians, you will lose votes of Arabs and Muslims and many ethnic groups in the United States that support the Palestinian struggle. And if you do the opposite, you will lose the support of the Jewish lobbies and Jewish supporters, Israel supporters. So the most clever thing is to keep silent, which is what Trump has been doing. Of course, the other party cannot be silent, because they are in power and they are in charge, and they have to run the American Middle East policy. So it's very vague what will happen if Trump is going to win. Therefore, there is a big question mark about the effect of the coming American election on the Middle East. But in general, the two parties are competing in showing more support to Israel and more bias to Israel. And as we all know, in fact, it's not Israel that is fighting now in Gaza and in Lebanon and against Iran. It is fighting with the full participation and backing with the United States. So as far as we Palestinians are concerned, we do not differentiate between Israel and the United States. And we do not differentiate between the candidate of the Democratic Party and the other candidate. I move now to China. Frankly speaking, we are very disappointed with the, I cannot say the position, I would say the lack of position on behalf of both China and Russia. Russia has different interests in the region. They have chosen to be almost silent. They make statements here and there that is very well calculated, but they do not give the kind of support that we expect. Maybe because they are too busy and too overwhelmed in the Ukrainian war. And the same goes for China. China have chosen to keep its distance in this war that is happening and in this Israeli continued genocide against the Palestinians. China is neither speaking strongly in condemnation of Israel, nor is trying to make even diplomatic efforts towards ending this war and ending this ongoing killing of Palestinians. So unfortunately, that leaves us with the United States and their allies in Europe, whom are all completely biased to Israel. And that makes the challenge much, much bigger for the Palestinians now.
Well, this was also very clear. Thank you. Flavia Xavier, she has a question. I have a question. Professor Ghassan talked about a left wing in Israel. How would you describe the left wing agenda in Israel today, if there is any?
It depends on your definition to left. In Israel, there are internal debate on two levels, political and ideological. And when I said earlier in my presentation that there is a clear process of radicalization in Israel, I meant both. I meant that Israel is shifting politically to the right to the extent that the original traditional leftist parties in Israel, like the Labour Party and others, have moved from representing almost half of the population in Israel into being represented with 1 or 2 or 3 and maximum 5 seats in the 120 seats of the Israeli parliament that is called the Knesset. So the left, the political left in Israel, is marginalized to the extent that it's not visible. I mean, we live here with Israel, under Israel. We follow closely the Israeli internal politics. And I can tell you the left is not visible in Israel at all. It vanished almost completely. On the ideological level, the same. The secular parties in Israel is losing ground gradually, and the Orthodox religious fundamentalist parties are gaining the ground. That's why one of the most important things to understand about the reality here is this transformation that is taking place inside Israel. Israel that we talk about now is no longer Israel that we knew, that we negotiated with, that we reached agreement with 25 years ago or 30 years ago. This is, some writers in Israel now call it New Israel. This is Israel with majority of political right, majority of fundamentalist religious Orthodox groups that are gaining the ground very fast. And by the way, there is also in parallel, and this is very important, a change in demographic balance, because Israel had two kind of Jewish people. There is the Jews, the Oriental Jews, and the Western Jews. The Jews who immigrated to Israel from European countries, and the Oriental Jews who immigrated to Israel from Arab countries, from the East, like from Morocco, from Yemen, from Iraq. The Oriental Jews first are reproducing in incredible rate. Each family would have like 10, 12, 15 children, while the Jewish families from Western origin, from European origin, like Europeans and like Americans, each family would have one child or two. So there is a quick shift in demographic balance. And the Oriental Jews are the social base for the right-wing governments and for the right-wing parties. So the demographic change is reinforcing the trend of radicalization in Israel. Add to this the fact that the part of the Jewish citizens who immigrate outside Israel are mainly the Jewish families from European origin, while the Jewish families from Oriental origin do not immigrate outside Israel. So we see three processes of change: demographic change, ideological change, and political change, which have already led into the new reality in Israel. Israel that is less and less democratic, Israel that is less and less scientific, and Israel that is more and more religious and fundamentalist and reactionaries.
Thank you. Professor Mohammed has a question you want to ask directly. Professor Mohammed, please.
Yeah. Minister, what about the Arab position, if there is a position? And what about the future in Palestine? Still can talk about two-state solution or not? Or even we can talk neither about state solution, maybe the persecution of the Palestinian at all.
Yeah, thank you. First, about the Arab position. There is also significant and important change in the Arab position. Historically speaking, the main backing for the Palestinian people, the PLO, the Palestinian struggle, used to come from the Arab countries. And even the non-Arab countries used to support Palestinians for many reasons, including the positive influence of the Arab countries. This has changed dramatically. Now, most of the Arab countries consider that this is no longer an Arab cause as much as it is a Palestinian cause. And the Palestinians who have chosen to get into a peace process with Israel and to sign an Oslo agreement should bear responsibility for that agreement and for their relations with Israel. The Arabs have been involved only in financial support and some political and diplomatic limited support. Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, some of the Arab countries have entered into normal relations with Israel, even though they never had any conflict before that with Israel, like the Arab Emirates. But there is an interesting angle to this change in the current period. you know, now the party that is leading the fight with Israel on behalf of the Palestinian people is Hamas. And Hamas happened to be part of the Iranian-led alliance in the region. They call it in Arabic محور المقاومة, the resistance axle that includes Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran, Yemen, Iraq, etc. Most of the Arab countries have big problem with Iran. And the fact that in the current phase of the Palestinian history, Hamas is in the lead of the Palestinian fight against Israel, and Hamas is in alliance with Iran, this aspect is contributing to neutralizing at least the Arab support to the Palestinians. Because for the Arab Gulf states particularly, they believe that the major threat to them is coming from Iran. And the fact that Palestinian Hamas is in alliance with Iran does not encourage these Arab Gulf countries to stand clearly in support of the Palestinians under the leadership of Hamas. That factor contributes negatively to the Arab position and involvement, especially in the current situations. The second part of your question is about the future. I think that the idea of two states is no longer valid, is no longer possible. Until recently, we used to justify this conclusion by the reality Israel is creating through the settlement expansion in the West Bank, and at that time in Gaza as well, before their withdrawal. Because we used to say that with the expansion of settlements, the reality in the West Bank is not going to allow for the establishment of a Palestinian state. But I don't think that this is a very strong argument, because if there is a political will, we can find a way. But I think the new reality in Israel is now killing the idea of two-state solution. Because, you know, two-state solution require an agreement with Israel and require an Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza in order to establish a Palestinian state and to have two states. The current political reality in Israel does not suggest any possibility of an Israeli acceptance of two-state solution, of or an Israeli withdrawal from any part of the Palestinian territories. So the current reality in Israel is responsible for the fact that two-state solution is no longer a possibility. That brings us to the other possible solution, at least theoretically, which is the one-state solution. And although one-state solution is not possible, because it will mean that Israel will lose majority in this one state from the river to the sea. But in fact, we are living what is called in literature one-state reality. It's not a one-state solution, but it's one-state reality. Because now Israel has control over all historical Palestine, or what they like to call it Greater Israel, from the river to the sea. And whether this area is with Palestinian majority or with Jewish majority, it's all under different levels of Israeli control. Therefore, it's one-state reality. However, the main characteristic of this reality is apartheid. And my conclusion is that we are drifting, we are practically speaking drifting into an apartheid one-state reality. Whether Israel want this or not, their policies, their practices is creating, practically speaking, one-state apartheid reality.
Very interesting. We have two questions left, although maybe part of it you already answered. But Lisa Marquezini dos Santos, she asked, Professor, do you think it's still possible for the Palestinian Authority to gain the trust of the Palestinian society back? What should happen in order for that to happen?
Yeah. That's the $1 million question, because if we have an answer to this question, we probably can become rich, because the Palestinian Authority is looking for an answer to this question. What can they do in order to restore confidence of the Palestinian people? I think the Palestinian Authority is a victim of the Israeli policies that resulted in the failure of the peace process. Because, the PLO, the Palestinian leadership, thought that by replacing the armed struggle with diplomacy, and by replacing the struggle for liberating all historical Palestine by adopting the two-state solution, they might have a shortcut to achieving the national objectives of the Palestinians, which is establishing a Palestinian state in West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. However, with the changes in Israel and with the changes in the Israeli policy, the agreement was killed by Israel, and the Palestinian Authority is a victim of that. Now, what can they do in order to restore confidence? I think there are two levels of things that the PA can do in order to restore at least part of the confidence. The first one has nothing to do with Israel. It has to do with internal aspects, and it's of two folds. The first one is election. One of the problems and one of the reasons for misunderstanding and mistrust between the Palestinian public and the Palestinian leadership is that the public do not have the chance for regular election of our leadership. So if the Palestinian Authority will allow regular elections, I think that might bridge, partially at least, the gap between the Palestinian public and the Palestinian Authority. For example, that might bring about a new generation of leadership, that might bring about, that might allow participation of different sectors in the Palestinian Authority, that might create the kind of accountability that is needed in order to restore confidence between any government, any authority, and its people. The second, on the internal level, is the need to reform the Palestinian Authority, because there is a lot of bad management. There is a lot of there is lack of good governance. We need measures of reforms to improve the governance performance of the Palestinian Authority. And I think that such reforms might improve, to a certain extent, the image of the Palestinian Authority in the eyes of the Palestinian public. That's on the internal level. On the external level, I think that Israel, the Palestinian Authority should stop any hopes on its relations and coordinations with Israel and the United States. They should give up the coordination that they have with Israel and the confidence that they have in the United States. And they need to adopt new policies that are no longer requesting the two-state solution, because it's no longer possible, and the Palestinian public do not believe on that objective, because they see and feel that it's not possible, and move into politics based into right-based politics rather than a solution politics, right-based politics, a politics that is based on fighting for the rights of the Palestinians, the rights of the Palestinians inside Israel, the rights of the Palestinian refugees, the rights of the Palestinians under the Israeli occupation, on the basis of the stipulations of the international law. And finally, the PA can improve its public stand and restore confidence of the public also by showing more seriousness and more serious efforts towards reconciliation and national unity, being more serious and make more efforts into ending this dispute and split between Fatah and Hamas, and allowing for national unity, which the Palestinian public aspire very strongly.
Thank you very much. This is also interesting. Then I will put two questions that still came together, and then there is still another one. But so if you allow me, so one question is, it's on the United States and Israel. So you explained that whether it's Democrat or Republican, it's always pro-Israel, and Trump even more than normal. But the question that Eduardo asked himself is, why does the United States insist in supporting Israel and not the Palestinian rights? And linked to that, Beatriz Santana asks, do you believe Israel's power in the region still largely depends on US support, or has it changed with Israel normalizing relations with Arab countries, especially considering commercial and military cybersecurity ties?
Yeah, very interesting questions. Thank you very much for these questions, especially the last part of it. Why this US support to Israel? It's, international relations is based on interests, and Israel is serving the interests of the United States in the Middle East. Take, for example, the current situations. There is a great deal of tension in the Middle East in general between the opponents of the United States and its allies in the region, their allies being the Arab countries and Israel, from Iran. The fact that Israel is fighting against Iran and against its allies like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthi in Yemen would serve the American interests in the region and would serve the interests of the allies of the United States in the region. Take, for example, the situations in Syria in the last few years. Iran was trying to build up military presence in Syria. That would be a strategic threat to the interests of the United States and its allies in the region. So Israel, and I'm talking before the current war, was regularly attacking and bombarding the Iranian presence in Syria in order to prevent Iran from expanding its strategic influence in a new country that is Syria. So whatever Israel is doing is serving the interests of the United States and the West in general in the region. That's why Israel is receiving unlimited support from the United States because they are in the same camp. And whatever achievements Israel is doing are going to be considered achievements for both, for United States and for Israel. And when Israel succeeds in creating normal relations with United States allies among the Arab countries like the Arab Emirates and Morocco, and they're trying to work on Saudi Arabia, but until now it's not working, then this is also an achievement for the United States because it will help them improving the coordination between the different allies of the United States in the region in the face of Iran, which is a strategic threat to the American hegemony in the region. That's part of the story. The other part is that there is a very, very strong lobby in the United States that keep pushing the American governments to even consolidate this American support to Israel. And we have many examples in the recent history. I will bring one example. When President Obama, in his second term as president, decided to be active in trying to solve the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, he realized that the major obstacle is the Israeli settlements and the expansion of settlements. So he tried to convince, between brackets, convince Israel to stop the expansion of settlements. And that created unprecedented tension between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu at that time. What Netanyahu did is that he pulled strings in the United States by going and speaking in the American Congress without coordination with the White House. And that was a sign of challenge to the American president. Since then, the Jewish lobby and the Israeli lobby, because it's not all Jewish, because there are also significant Christian forces in the United States that are part of the Israeli lobby. They moved against Obama until Obama realized that he has to pay a heavy internal political price for his Middle East policy, so he decided to give up. So the second reason for the unusual support to Israel in the United States is the strong Israeli lobby in the United States, and that's correct, but to less extent in other European Western countries. The second part of the question is very interesting. To what extent Israel is dependent on the United States, especially after it shows how advanced it is in terms of the advanced weapons technology, etc. I think the end of this war is going to give the answer. It's a little bit early to give an answer. For example, in the first phase of this war, when Israel was having significant difficulties in its fight against Hamas, when it took Israel about a year trying to defeat Hamas and to find the Israeli hostages without any success, that reality in that phase of the war shaken to a large extent the strategic weight of Israel and gave the impression that not Iran, even one small proxy of Iran, which is Hamas, is strong enough that Israel is not able to defeat. And Israel needed 1 year without being able to finally defeat that proxy of Hamas, of Iran, which shifted the balance of powers, the strategic regional balance of powers, to the favor of Iran. And the fact that the United States had from the beginning of that war to move with its military navy, with its president, with its secretary of defense, with its weapons to rescue Israel in the face of Iran and its allies, showed a shift in the balance of powers against the favor of Hamas and to the favor of Iran, and showed Israel dependent on the United States in order to protect itself and in order to reach victory. Now, this strategic picture have changed recently after the Israeli military achievements in Lebanon, when they succeeded in the pagers explosions and in the assassination of most of the leaders of Hezbollah, and in their incursion in southern Lebanon, and recently the killing of the Hamas leader Sinwar, that restored the strategic weight on Israel in the face or in the strategic competition between Iran and its camp on one hand, and Israel and its camp, or the United States and Israel and their camp on the other hand. So the answer of the question of whether Israel is able to defend itself or it is still dependent on Israel will be answered when this war will end. If it will end with a decisive military victory of Israel, then the answer will be that Israel managed to preserve its strategic strength, with the need of the American support always. But if Israel will continue for much longer with no decisive victory, then that will be a different answer to the question, and it will show that Israel needs to remain dependent on the United States, and without the support of the United States, Israel will not be able to face the challenges of its opponents in the region. So this question and many other very important strategic questions will have to wait until the end of this war, which is not going to be soon.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah, there is a question because you explained us about Iran, the position of Iran and its allies, and at some point you said that Iran poses a threat to other Arab countries, and that's where. And the question that Isadora Mashal and also Helena Giordano, they asked themselves, what threat does Iran pose to other Arab countries?
Yes. It's a serious threat, frankly speaking. I mean, I don't have much sympathy with these Arab countries for different reasons. But objectively speaking, from political analytical point of view, Iran is a very strong regional country, and part of its ideology is what they call exporting revolution. And by the way, there is now debate inside Iran. There is a camp in Iran which is calling for the transformation of Iran from the stage of revolution and exporting revolution into the phase of economic prosperity. But this is not our subject. What I'm trying to say is that Iran believes ideologically that it has the mission of exporting revolution, Islamic revolution, in the rest of the Islamic world. And for that purpose, they support financially, diplomatically, ideologically, but also with arms, opposition groups in many Arab countries. In Iran, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Gaza. This is number one. Number two, there is always tension between the Arab Gulf states and Iran, because the Iranians keep threatening these Arab countries that are militarily very weak and heavily dependent on the military support and protection of the United States. I read recently a scientific article that explains that Iranian policy, and its theme is like the following, and I borrow this argument because it helps answering this question. Immediately after the Iranian Revolution, we witnessed 8 years war, which is called the First Gulf War, between Iran and Iraq. And most of that war was happening in the Iranian territories. And the argument is that Iran have learned the lesson and decided that from now onward, any conflict, any competition, any tension between Iran and its neighboring Arab countries should be in the Arab land. And therefore, they encouraged the Shiite communities in Arab countries, encouraged them, supported them, encouraged them to become, to have military forces. And therefore, now, all kind of Iranian-Arab tension or conflict is happening within the Arab territories rather than in Iran. Therefore, I think that the Arab countries are justified, from my point of view, when they feel that there is an Iranian threat, because there is an Iranian threat. And Iran is encouraging armed groups with ideological affiliation to Iran in many of the Arab countries. If you go back to famous speeches of late Hassan Nasrallah, who was the leader of Hezbollah, assassinated recently by Israel, he had very interesting speeches not recently, a few years ago, in which he was very explicit that the objective of Iran and its allying groups in the region is to continue fighting until they establish the Islamic State in the Muslim world under the leadership of the Iranian religious leadership. So there is a threat and there is a problem. And I think that the fact that, I repeat something I said earlier, the fact that Hamas, who is now leading the Palestinian fight against Israel, happened to be in alliance with Iran, that is one of the factors that reduces or a little bit neutralize the Arab support to the Palestinians.
Okay, thank you. Do you allow me the last question? One more question?
Yeah, please.
Finish up. And there's also, of course, what's interesting, Hamas, of all these groups, is of course the only one who's not Shiite. It's a Sunnite group.
Of course.
Yeah. Okay, then Helena, the last question is, listening to you, Professor Khatib, I understand that most Israelis are supporting apartheid, and this raises view of the Palestinians, right? How do you see, or how do you feel, she asked, about the involvement of the Jewish community outside Israel, around the world, to expose and dissolve the racist?
This is very, very interesting. Recently, there has been a strong movement, especially in the United States, in support of Palestinians in Gaza, especially, and in protest against the Israeli massacres and genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. And in the United States in particularly, the young Jews are leading many of these protests. And this is a very positive and interesting phenomenon. And I think this is something that needs to be encouraged. However, we should keep in mind that the vast majority of the Jewish community in the United States is still in support of Israel and still closing an eye on the Israeli genocide and massacre against the Palestinians. The fact that there are few Jewish youths whom are taking a courageous, progressive, fair position is a very positive phenomenon that we are grateful for and that we need to keep encouraging without forgetting the fact that this is only a minority. I need here to add that this split in Israel that I explained earlier is also clear within the Jewish community in the United States. Part of them are in support of the Likud and the right-wing parties, and others are critical of these tendencies in Israel. And there is contradicting messages coming to Israel from the Jewish lobby, especially in the United States.
Well, with this, we end exactly at 3 o'clock, our fourth lecture, which is extremely interesting. I learned a lot. So thank you very much. And from the question, you can see that students are followed very with a lot of interest also. So for those who, with this, we end the 4 sessions, lectures of October. We will start again in November, the 12th of November, with Sociology of the Palestinian Society with Professor Alaa Alazeh. November 14 with the Palestinian women. November 19, Palestinian culture. And November 21, the last will be on Palestinian resistance and international solidarity. Is that right, Raghda?
Yes, that is right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think Professor Ghassan,
So
Professor Mohammed,
just to say شكرا سيد الوزير بارك الله فيك على المحاضرة.
Thank
you very much.
Let me also express my gratitude for the opportunity to meet with you and to speak to your students. And also on behalf of my university, we are grateful for this joint program, which I think is an example that we will learn from in our relations with many other universities in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Raghda. Thank you, Professor Mohammed. And we see each other again then in November. Bye-bye. Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.